I am your host, Jessica Aldridge, and it is my honor to welcome our special guest, Dr. Joanne Brasch, Special Projects Manager for California Product Stewardship Council. Welcome to EcoJustice Radio.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm really excited to be here today.
Well, thank you for being here. We've known each other for quite a while and working in the waste industry today. And I have so many questions when it comes to textiles and textiles waste. And that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the end of life management and their environmental and social impacts. But before we jump into like how they can be recycled, or what about mixed synthetics, or what technology exists, because we're going to get to all of that, I think we need to start with those basics. Joanne, what is considered textiles? What are they made from? And how much of our clothing is manufactured and disposed of every year, globally and maybe locally?
So at the very basic level, textiles are fabrics. In most of our lives, we interact with fabrics on clothing. These are knitted, these are woven types of fabrics. But if you look in kind of the more expansive scope of your life and the world using textiles, there's a lot of different types of textiles that are not just the knits and wovens. So you have things that are like non-wovens. These are often used, like think about the material that your single-use masks are made out of. That's considered a textile. So there's different types of fabrics, not just the ones on our clothing, but also industrial type and commercial textiles that make up the fabrics of our life.
And how much is being created every year?
That's truly an unknown. Like we don't
Wow.
know how many products are being brought into our market. We don't know how much are brought in and what percentage is sold. That's a really dark data spot in kind of the life cycle of these products. But we do know what's coming out at the waste, and we see what's coming into the thrifts and the collectors. We see what's hitting the landfills through waste characterization reports. And we know that volume is immense. Like it's one of the top materials in our waste stream here in California. And over the last few years, it's one of the fastest growing waste streams. Our agency for waste authority at the state level, we call them CalRecycle. And CalRecycle studies our waste streams every 4 years through these waste characterization reports. And in 2018, their characterization was that textiles was about 3% of the residential and the commercial waste stream. But CPSC has gone in to do local waste characterizations, specifically in Los Angeles. Within the city of Los Angeles, especially if you look in some of the districts with manufacturing, textiles can be upwards of 6% of the waste stream. And that's just their local waste stream. When you look at the global scale, you can see where the textiles are really accumulating are in these secondhand markets. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, I'm sure, in the next few questions.
That's crazy. And, and it's depends on where you live. Like even globally in Europe, there's immense amount of textiles that are coming out of Europe as well. I want to talk about the current state of disposal when it comes to textiles and clothing that's, no longer of use by the owner. If textiles are placed in what we call curbside recycling container, and that meaning if you have a recycling container that is collected directly from your home or your business, what happens to textiles that are put in that container? Can those textiles be properly recycled this way?
Well, I definitely encourage all listeners to not put textiles in the recycling bin unless their jurisdiction really encourages that. But we've seen some major cities in California try that. And we'll specifically talk about San Francisco. But at the end of the day, we can't put these soft fabrics in with our hard plastics for a bunch of reasons. One of them is they absorb. So any of the residual food waste or the liquids render these textiles no longer recyclable if they absorb fats, let's say. They also tangle in the machines as our MRFs and these big conveyor belts. These fabrics actually tangle in those machines. And what's really scary is they also combust. So textiles are
Wow.
considered, especially around machinery, a combustible contaminant. So when we see textiles in the recycling bin, it's actually a really expensive and dangerous problem to deal with at the solid waste side. But San Francisco tried. They told residents, put them in a bag, put them in your recycling bin. And what happened is those bags ripped. The textiles, pretty much almost all of the textiles that ended up at those MRFs collected curbside were not recyclable because of what I just talked about. So alternatively, they can do appointment-based picked up, or they can do partnerships with thrifts. But at the end of the day, they're really expensive to do door-to-door pickup. And we're talking about unusable textiles. People think what I put to the curbside should be what I'm not able to take to the thrifts. It's not usable. So I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about usability and the recycling options that are out there.
Yeah, I want to talk about thrift next. We'll definitely talk about the recycling ability and technology that exists and hopefully will exist. What if someone takes their clothing to a thrift store, and let's say that some of the clothing is great condition, so hopefully it's reused, and then others may be torn and tattered or not usable, maybe based on it's just not sellable, no one wants it. How much of the stuff that is dropped off at a thrift store is actually then thrown away? And because I don't think they usually talk about that.
It's not talked about. It's also not reported. So the data that we have, whether it's 20%, 30% that's unusable. CPSC's done some audits on what's been collected. We saw about like 30% wasn't usable, but they're not required to report that data. And at the end of the day, as long as the usable items have enough value, no one's talking about the things that don't have value. So a lot of times, those items that are, damaged or just not usable, the options are landfilling it locally where it's collected, or sometimes it can get mixed into bales, whether it's mixed in with the good stuff or it's mixed into like a low grade bale. And those bales are sold to secondary brokers or kind of downstream resellers.
And what about the small private companies that say that they'll collect your textiles from your house, or others allow you to mail them in, or there's those drop boxes in the middle of a like parking lots where you're able to like shove the material into the hole, and you're like, oh, this will be quote unquote recycled. What's usually happening to those textiles in these different scenarios?
I always encourage people to ask questions, look into the companies, because at the end of the day, the word recycling for textiles isn't regulated. So a lot of times these garments are collected under the guise of recycling. But as I previously mentioned, it's just mixed into a bale and ultimately dumped on the secondhand market. So a lot of these kind of small startups or kind of innovative collectors or even the original collectors like the kiosks around town, a lot of times what happens is it goes to a sortation facility. The things that are usable are taken out. But across the board, even if one or two technologies are available for certain materials, like 100% cottons have a great market for reuse and recycling, we always come down to the same thing. And a lot of the collectors are having the same problem is these mixed blends, low quality, damaged. There's really not much we can do with these fabrics today. And so that's a problem that shouldn't have to be solved by the thrifts. It shouldn't have to be solved by our waste authorities. And so at my work at the California Product Stewardship Council, we really thrive in the space of engaging the producers of these products to help us solve these problems so that the cost of solving these problems doesn't fall on the consumers and on the public.
So in these situations with these private companies, and they're saying that the material might be getting recycled or it's getting sorted out, and some of it's going to value resource such as ragging. Like, oh, don't worry, we're gonna turn this stuff into rags, or we're gonna turn this stuff into insulation. What does it really mean when we're turning things into rags? And can any of the textiles be rags?
very select types of textiles can actually be used for a rag. So it has to be a natural fiber so it absorbs, because synthetics are plastic, so they don't actually absorb the fabric or the water. The other thing is it has to be, white, no print. It can't be majorly stained. So there is a market for rags, let's say in upcycled sheets and linens. But that's also a really high value fiber because you can also take 100% cotton that's white and retwist it into yarns. Or you can take it to a more innovative recycling technology and do like a cellulosic fiber that is, coming out more like a tencel cotton based kind of type of fiber. So there's a lot of technology and options for processing the fabrics out there. Ragging is one of the most oldest, industries and options for that, but they can really just take a very select types of fabrics. And we see that across the board, even with designers trying to do upcycled collections or even, high capacity recyclers, they can only take very specific material specifications for their process. So sorting becomes one of the most important components of getting them the right materials.
And we'll talk about this later as well, but isn't, the majority of our clothing, 60% of our clothing or something is made out of synthetics? So it's like a plastic blend.
Again, we'll never know the true number, but it is probably higher than that. When we've done some studies here at CPSC studying fiber content, what's going through these thrift stores that we see in the market, because it's not actually reported. Even in the materials coming across customs, they don't have to report their fiber content under 10%. So there's a lot of unknowns on what's in our clothing.
And then you were talking about these bales, being shipped off. And I wanted to talk about bales being shipped off because when I think of bales being shipped off, being in the waste industry, right, it's like we're baling, water bottles and shipping them off to a water bottle, recycler here in California. Or if you're, a recycler on the East Coast, you're baling it and you're sending paper to a paper mill to be recycled. Those are the bales that we ship off. And so if these companies, if these small businesses that are going and collecting our textiles, or the thrift stores or whomever it is that has access to, wasted textiles, wasted clothing, are then bailing it, where are these bales going, right? And so there was there's been multiple exposés in regards to clothing being dumped in other countries as a means of diversion, then calling it, and diversion meaning saying, oh, it was reused or it was recycled. And recently there was some exposés that came out of the OR Foundation in Ghana, and another was the Changing Markets Foundation regarding what's happening in Kenya. And the Changing Markets Foundation documentary, it's called Trashin, revealed that 300 million items of what they call junk plastic clothing, because that clothing is made out of plastic, are dumped on Kenya per year. And this causes major health and environmental issues for vulnerable communities. And some people, I think, they may think that they're doing a good thing by donating their clothes that are then sent to another country where they believe that their clothing would benefit another person because they perceive that person in the other country to have a lack of resources, saying like, oh, well, they don't have access to clothes in the way that I do, so I'm going to send them my clothing. So that's a really good idea. Probably not a really good idea. So can you speak to what's happening when textiles are sent to other countries, and maybe what's happening with some of these exposés?
Yeah, and just great work coming out of the OR Foundation and Accra and Changing Markets. And really glad that we have organizations who are boots on the ground in some of these places to really call out the causes of some of these problems. And ultimately, we can talk about what's usable, what's not usable, what's waste, not waste. But what we see is, like you said, really low quality plastic fabrics. These stain easier, they lose their shape. They're just like, if you wouldn't put it on your own body, like you shouldn't really expect someone else to put it on their body. And so what we're seeing in some of these secondhand markets, mixed in these bales, are just low quality fast fashion. And so when we go back to that question you asked me, how many products are on the market? we really don't know, but we're seeing high volumes just kind of accumulate in different places along the life cycle. And what's unfortunate when we talk about, especially environmental justice issues, in the waste in general, is where you see the waste accumulating is usually the most impacted communities. And so for this product specifically, we see the products to the textiles accumulating in markets that don't have the same landfill regulations. They don't have the same access to recycling, and they don't have the same access to funds for all the work that they're doing, sorting and upcycling, and they're really the ones doing the work for the circular economy. So at the end of the day, when we're trying to solve the issue, we have to think about all the people within the life cycle that are impacted by, the false claims of reuse and recycling.
And even if they had the technology to quote unquote recycle this stuff, they're getting 300 million items. They're, waste colonization, as one of our guests in the past, called it. And it's, and then this is that there's dumping into the land and the river. There's pollution from the chemicals from these products, alone from just the product itself being in the land or river. There wasn't there, or can you speak to some of the stat on the water contamination?
Yeah, and actually, this is some of the science that's coming from the OR Foundation. So their recent report on stop waste colonialization, which is really interesting and talking about, just not only the environmental burdens, but the social and the cost burdens that are being dumped on these markets. And so you asked me about the environmental and the stats specifically. And so we're seeing, I can't speak specifically to like the stats on the volume of what they're seeing. It's a great report. They have a lot of wonderful data. But what I found most interesting is just the environmental evidence that we're seeing, is the rivers, the beaches. They have, when there's a storm, the textiles wash up on their beaches and they call them tanglers. And it's like seaweed and natural matter mixed with multiple garments all tangled. And at that point, it's trash. You can't recycle or upcycle any of that. So the other thing that I found really interesting, some of the science coming out of the OR Foundation, is they have been testing the microfibers. And we talk about that here in the global north. We've been doing a lot of great action here in California. And some of the thresholds that we've set as a state, they're finding over 10 times higher the volume of microfibers in their rivers because of the textiles that are being dumped on their market. I'm not sure when that information will be published, but if you look at the waste colonialization, and they just recently published a video and specifically talking about the water, in those communities, water is so important, that it's really heartbreaking to see the global north impacting one of their most important resources.
And we're going to link back. So listeners, if you want more information about microplastics and microfibers, we did a episode on EcoJustice Radio. So we will link back to that in the blog. So make sure that you check that out as well. And I just wanted to, before we go to the break, do they still do this where if there's a sports game and you've got two different teams and they don't know who's going to win, so they make jerseys and clothing and merchandise specifically for both teams winning. And then whatever team didn't win, that's just a waste product that they send off. Does that still happen?
I don't work for any of those companies. I think it's just one of those dirty little secrets that, we all found out, and it's probably still happening because these producers are not required to report. What are you making? What is this material? Like, what do we do with it at the end? And I think that's just where everyone's just at our breaking point with this particular topic. Is we can go in circles, we can sort, we can collect, but if there isn't a way to safely manage these materials, that's on the producers. They got to help us solve this problem.
Exactly. And we're going to go to the break, and we're going to be right back to talk about how can the manufacturers take responsibility? What's going to have to happen? Does there need to be state legislation? Does there need to be federal legislation? And what are some of the solutions? So stay tuned, and we'll be right back. So, Jan, we have been talking about textiles waste, the manufacturing of textiles, how there's a lack of transparency and there's a lot of barriers to recycling textiles while also, preserving the material so that something can be done with it. I want to discuss what you feel are the prime solutions to managing wasted clothing and other textiles and why, and let's first start again. I first want to start with why the act of repairing is the first and primary solution and how it can be scaled up to make an economic and environmental difference.
In the wonderful world of waste, we have a guide which is called the waste hierarchy. And it's kind of an order of preference on how you should handle your materials that have the lowest impact on the earth. And first and foremost is source reduction. Source reduction means you're buying less, there's less materials in our waste stream. And the act of repairing is a service of source reduction. So if you're personally repairing your items, you're probably going to be buying less. If thrifts and big brands sold repaired items, they wouldn't really have to be creating new ones. So when we talk about the circular economy, and you have to look at what materials are already in our economy. And at the end of the day, and I keep saying at the end of the day, you have to look at the materials are already in our economy. And when we look at the rate of consumption and the rate of production, it is arguably already enough materials here to sustain our clothing needs for a long time.
How do we make these repair shops sustainable? I know that we're going to get into the legislation concept, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but maybe like just a teaser on, I go to a cobbler. I have a cobbler. I have a family friend who fixes my clothing, who hems my pants, who when I go to a clothing swap and something is just a little too loose, will take it in for me or something of that nature, right? But how do we just make sure that these repair options are accessible and sustainable? Sustainable meaning that they can sustain, like we're not losing this craft.
The great thing about repair businesses is they're already existing in our communities. We have a lot of tailors and garment cleaning businesses, and a lot of times these are already owned by marginalized community members. So finding ways to, again, keeping the money flowing with the materials. So you as an individual can take your garments, you can get them mended. I love to see kind of a lot of these businesses coming online, getting really techy with it. But that isn't the long-term solution because we as individuals can only do so much. We have to get the brands involved who are working with scaled materials. So looking at brands who offer repair services or even offering mended and kind of upcycled garments is a really great way to support these businesses. One of the interesting things I learned was Nordstrom is one of the largest employers of garment workers in the country. And so we would really love to see, the tailors come back. One of the proposals we're going to talk about here in California really leans on our garment workers. We have one of the largest communities of skilled craftspeople here in California. We have a wonderful licensing system, and we passed a few years ago a law called SB 62, which guaranteed all garment workers getting a minimum wage. So we've lined ourselves up to be like a circular economy manufacturing hub for textiles because we supported our repair businesses and our garment workers first.
And I feel like we'll jump to the next question in a second. But I feel like, there's the ability to support and push forward, a craftspeople economy, no matter where you live, because no matter if it's for textiles like we're talking about today, or it's electronics, or it's furniture, or whatever it may be, this is an economy that we can grow upon throughout the United States, throughout the global economy. So I want to talk about another solution. So let's say that we've repaired everything in the ideal perfect world, right? Now we have clothing and textile waste that can no longer be reused or repaired. And now let's say that we collect all of it together. how do we upgrade our sorting practices? You know, as we talked about before, it's like, can we recycle all the textile fabrics together, like mix natural fibers with an array of different mixed synthetics? And the conclusion to that was no, we can't recycle all of that together. So because we can't, what needs to exist in order to separate these textiles by fabric content type while also preserving the integrity of that material so that you can get the best use out of it?
One of the end goals is to sort these materials closer to the point where they're collected so that we're not expecting other economies to have the burden of sorting it, because no one really has anything to do with a lot of these kind of mixed blends. But what we really need, there's a big gap in technologies, and there's a lot of, there's maybe 6 or 7 companies really on the forefront of fiber identification technologies. We previously talked about how labels are not required to list all the fibers. And some of these fibers are even labeled, branded. We really don't know what's in our fabric. So these fiber identification technologies are able to identify to a certain degree percentage of the primary fiber and what type of primary fiber within, a few categories. And this really helps recyclers because they can only put certain materials into their technologies. So if you have a $30 million machine, you're not going to throw some unknown materials that could gum it up or could really clog it. So pre-sorting and then a secondary sort are really what's needed to sort for end markets. For so long, things just got into mixed bales, putting the responsibility on other people. But by doing the sorting closer to home, we can sort for those end markets and ultimately send cleaner, more monogamous fibers, monofibers.
I like that.
By sorting closer to home, we can send mixed bales that are cleaner and have more similar fiber types within them.
So now we sorted it, right? So now it has to be recycled. And that's a primary solution. When textiles and clothing aren't able to be, sorry, let me take that again. When textiles and clothing aren't able to be recycled, their end of life could, as we've discussed, result in environmental and social justice concerns. How do you define successful recycling when it comes to textiles? And are there some examples that you could share where wasted clothes are being successfully collected and recycled? And what ideal scenarios would you like to see?
We'll start with the ideal, right? If you look up the organization Fibershed, they make this really great comparison of kind of like our watersheds, looking at our fiber sheds and what do we have access to regionally. And kind of aligned with that are the solutions are really soil to soil based and natural fibers. I think those have the most potential for textile to textile recycling because you can shred them, retwist them, they're really durable. When you start looking at some of the synthetic fabrics, although they're recyclable if they're not blended, there are other concerns with like chemicals and microfibers. So looking at solutions, I would say, the best examples are the organic, naturally dyed cotton, but that's not accessible to everyone. And so we see a lot of brands really looking to scale access. Now, I know H&M is under a lot of scrutiny for a lot of other aspects, but they're one of the largest buyers of organic cotton. And looking at how we can support the markets we want to see in the world really takes the companies, buying what they need to do, buying the right ingredients, and designing products that are easier to manage.
And do you see new recycling technology coming onto the market or the potential for new types of recycling technology where they're able to really get at these different mixed components?
Absolutely. And I'm not paid enough to endorse any of them. And honestly, if I don't know exactly what energy use and what's coming out in the
Mm-hmm.
water, I'm, not going to endorse any of them. But when you look at just the oldest history, like really, like recycling cotton is not new, and so when you look at what are the new technologies, there's a lot of like cellulosic recycling where you can kind of blend it up, make a little concoction, extrude it as a new fiber. There's a lot of what I find interesting is kind of the enzymatic digestion, which is basically fermentation, like a beer process for those mixed fiber blends so that the naturals can be separated from the synthetics. But at the end of the day, there are so many fibers blended together that like innovative recycling technologies that are used for plastics can't be used for textiles if they're not pre-sorted.
And it also sounds like maybe we need to be changing the type of textiles that's created because, just like in the waste industry, if it can't be recycled or composted, then it needs to be in a zero waste system, needs to be worked out of the system. So why are we giving people product and then just saying, well, there has to be a downstream solution for this? You've got to figure it out, waste industry. You've got to figure it out, jurisdiction or city. It's on you. We created the product, but you have to figure it out versus, well, now we have to change the product. We can't continue putting this amount of mixed resources into the textile or mixing it with natural fiber or whatever that might be. Another primary solution that you've mentioned to me is chemical management. What do you mean by chemical management and how do you see that working?
So chemical management kind of relies on full transparency and disclosure throughout the supply chain because we have a globally produced product and a lot of the fabrics and fibers are made in countries that don't have to disclose what is put on or in these fabrics. It's up to the brands to take responsibility at this point to kind of manage what is being added intentionally or unintentionally, make sure that they're putting the safest product on our market. One of the most, some of the most talked about chemicals that are kind of hazardous within this industry, things like BPA. We knew that was dangerous in our water bottles, but now it's showing up, it's in our bras, it's in our sports wear, our leggings, our athletic wear. PFAS, the perfluoroalkyls, the waterproofing. Again, no one's required them to disclose whether or not they're using these chemicals. And they wash off in our wash. They're forever bioaccumulative, all the dangerous things that give us anxiety. And they're
What's
turning up as
bioaccumulative?
babies.
What's bioaccumulative?
Bioaccumulative means like as it kind of gets absorbed or ingested at the lower end of the food chain, it grows exponentially into the kind of larger mammals. So if a small fish is exposed, the bigger fish that eats it gets exposure to all the fish that eats. So it accumulates within the bigger fish, then we eat the fish and then we're exposed. So it grows the exposure rates up the food chain.
And when you're talking about BPA and these chemicals and the fluorinated chemicals, the PFAS, which again, listeners, if you want to hear about PFAS, definitely check out our interview with Rob Balot with EcoJustice Radio. But it's getting, as you said, the wash, then it's going into our water system. It's going out into the ocean or it's going into our drinking water. It's going into our soils. So as you said, it's bioaccumulating and then will eventually come back into our bodies and cause issue where, they're phthalates, they're endocrine disruptors, proven endocrine disruptors. So a human health impact issue, right? And then the microplastics too, right? Don't they fall into this sort of chemical management side of things as well?
Absolutely. A recent study, we are now seeing microplastics passing through the blood barrier, like they're in our veins. And one of the things they don't talk about, we're talking right now about, chemical management. There's a process in textile manufacturing called carding. They spray fibers onto your fabric to make it thicker so it folds nice, it feels fuller. That's why when you do that first wash, it's never the same. It's thinner feeling. And these carding fibers are not spun, they're not adhered, they're just loose. And we don't know what chemicals are mixed into that spray. So they're literally just adding microfibers that are designed to wash out. And, one of the things that we say in our network of advocates is we've been regulating tailpipes of cars for decades, but we are still not regulating the tailpipes of our washing machines.
That's a good point. And that carding, it could be that you have this organic cotton shirt, but they want it to be a little bit softer, and they will spray something that might not be organic cotton, and it's microfibers and it's chemicals. And so, like, I've had, you get a shirt and it's really, really soft and you just love it. And then you wash it and you're like, damn, it's not as soft as it was prior. Gross. It's awful. Oh my gosh. And we're going to go to the break here in a moment, but I want to talk about an example of this need for chemical management. There's a risk of chemical leachate, like we were talking about. And wasn't there a recall that happened with Disney and Gap for baby clothing?
Yeah, with lead. We've known
Yes.
lead has been dangerous for years. And what's really scary is once they get to the recall, that's when they've been caught and there's enough evidence. So what happened before then? So yeah, not to, get real scary with it, but there's also formaldehyde, and
Hmm.
we have also things like other heavy metals added into our textiles.
But it makes them bright and bold and beautiful. The color, right? That's where you're seeing it, right? In these really bold colors.
Absolutely. All in the coloration, usually in the pigmentation process, is when the most hazardous chemicals are added to the textiles. But they're added every step of the way. There's no requirement to disclose any of it.
So there needs to be a requirement to disclose. And we need organizations like the California Product Stewardship Council to push at the state and federal level to make sure that these do exist. And one thing that happened in California is that PFAS, the polyfluorinated, pre-polyfluorinated chemicals that make our clothing, um, water resistant and other claims of why that clothing might be better, but mostly, the water resistant, the grease resistant, that textiles can no longer have these fluorinated chemicals in them. But then, and that's by 2028, I think,
Mhm. Yeah, they
correct?
have quite a few years to get those out.
But then the other day, there's this announcement, REI is doing so great because, or maybe it was REI or Patagonia, one of them
Okay.
was REI, that they're going to remove all of the PFAS in their textiles and how great they are. And it's like, well, yeah, you were just legally made to do so in multiple states that passed this type of legislation. Maybe you want to speak to that a little bit before we go
Yeah,
to break.
I mean, we saw the same thing with Kerrygold, the butter at Costco. Like, we're gonna pull our products because we have PFAS in our butter wrappers. And it's like, well, that's because California passed the law that you can't sell in California if you have PFAS. So, um, but some of those chemical bans are really hard to enforce. It really takes scientists and labs and really an oversight agency willing to enforce. So it'll be interesting over the next few years to see how brands and retailers really phase these out. But when you look at the brands who've already invested in being green, and we know it's possible, we know. I mean, we see it in some of the really innovative brands out there.
And that's great. And obviously, they're going to use this opportunity for a marketing step for themselves to say, look how great we are. And when they're being forced to do so. So I, and it's because of the work of organizations like the California Product Stewardship Council. So we're going to go to break, but we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the work that y'all are doing and what we're going to see coming up here soon in regards to this textile waste management, what that's going to mean for manufacturers, how they're going to have to continue to step up and change their ways. So we'll be right back after the break. Stay with us. Joanne, thank you for being on the show today. We've been talking about textiles, recycling management, end of life management. What are the solutions? And you are from the California Product Stewardship Council. You are their textiles expert and their special projects manager. And you work on waste, or I guess California Product Stewardship Council works on waste related policies, such as management of textile waste. What is product stewardship and how does it relate to extended producer responsibility? Because I think both of those words might be new to a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of my job is educating so that people understand the difference. So product stewardship is kind of this category, this overarching expectation that brands and producers are going to be stewards of their products through its life cycle. So product stewardship can be voluntary. It could be something like a chemical ban, like we talked about, something that makes the management of these products easier and more efficient throughout this life cycle. Extended producer responsibility is under the category of product stewardship, but it's a very specific type of policy. And it's a type of policy, it's not voluntary. Here in California, there's examples around the country, around the world of voluntary EPR. But here in California and in other states throughout the country, there are different product types that are already managed under extended producer responsibility. And what EPR is, it's a program that is, it's a waste and recycling program that is run by the industry. It's funded by the industry and it's run by the industry. So the money never goes to the state and the materials never go to the state. It's truly not a government-run waste program. And the key features of an extended producer responsibility program, a good one, things like internalized costs. The consumer should not be paying a fee to fund the program. The producer should be funding it because the philosophy is if you pay for the end of life, you're going to design the product to be easier to manage at the end of life. So EPR here in California, we have 7 true EPR programs and a couple other similar types of policies that have maybe a consumer fee or less stringent requirements. Another component of EPR is performance standards, reporting and transparency, and enforcement. Without all of these components, these programs can go awry, right? Like we don't want to just let the industry do whatever they want. You have to put safeguards and clear expectations. You have to recycle X% by year, 20 whatever. And with these performance standards and clear enforcement measures, we've seen programs, producers really step up and create amazing programs that offer convenient collection for our consumers. So here in California, most recently in the last year, we passed 2 EPR bills for batteries and for packaging. So it would be a great time for me to introduce SB 707. It was a bill by Senator Josh Newman that was introduced mid-February, so February 16th. So we're really hot off the press here with this interview. And what this bill does is bring EPR for textiles to California. It brings a cooperative solution to these really challenging materials in a manner that is funded by the industry so that none of our garbage rates go up. The thrift stores don't have to raise their prices to deal with it. The producers of the products are at the table as we design this future waste program.
Yeah, that was my next question. That was my next question for you was, there's this Senate Bill 707 and, that what kind of systems would need to be in place? We were talking about all those primary solutions earlier. And how does Senate Bill 707, hopefully, knock on wood, passed, right? How would it put in place those primary solutions? How would it support those and sustain those primary solutions?
Yeah, so SB 707, as proposed, basically levels the playing field and makes things more equitable for the brands who've already invested in reuse, recycling, upcycling, repair, all the things that we love. So there's a couple provisions within the proposed program that really support these solutions. And one of them is the funding. If every brand is pitching in, there's a large pot of funds that are then able to use to kind of pay for these externalized costs. right now there's within the textile recycling realm, we see all these challenges like sorting technologies and ultimately transportation from sorting to the recycler, and other externalities like the environmental impacts and the injustices that are happening. So by creating a financial incentive to solving these problems, we see a lot of kind of collaborative solutions. So not one brand has to start investing in all the recycling technologies. Not one brand has to scale repair to large capacity. These funds are helping to bridge the gap in a manner that doesn't rely on public money, so that it's more market adaptive. Um, we can all agree we don't really want a state-run program, right? We don't want
Yeah.
states running our fashion recycling program. That would be best run by the industry. And I think this product type is a great example of how a successful EPR program can address the market deficiencies and the injustices.
How does it address the injustices to environmental and social issues?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest thing is following the funding. So right now, people are paying for recycling or sending in their recycling through those mail-in, and we don't know what's happening. So the
Yeah.
funding is in under an EPR goes to supporting the recyclers, supporting the sorters, and ultimately getting that data back to the oversight agency so that we know if someone's saying it's getting recycled, it's truly getting recycled. So the program tracks the ultimate end disposition of the materials, and the program is held to diminishing disposal rates. So they have to increase their repair and recycling as the years go by, and they have to reduce their disposal. So if it's getting disposed in another country, our program would be held responsible for those materials. So it adds
Mm.
transparency, it adds tracking, but ultimately it puts the funding to where the burden is.
And as you said, it just adds that layer of transparency so we actually know what's happening. And then, as we said previously, they're going to have to change their materials. If the material is not able to move within the system in an environmentally and social just way, then that material needs to move itself out of the system and a new material needs, or maybe even an old material, needs to take its place. Um, Talking about materials, oh, give me a second here because I think I just moved myself down a little bit. Do we pause it for a second, Jack? Okay. Talking about materials, and I just want to come back to this point a little bit, is that, these sustainable fashion choices, if they are going to start using a different material, if they're going to start investing in different manufacturing types, if they're going to say that their items are a more sustainable choice, sometimes those sustainable choices come with a very large sticker shock and it's not as accessible to people. So people may say, well, I'm not going to be able to afford this and I'm going to be stuck to only being able to buy X, Y, and Z, or I have to buy at low retail stores because I can't afford this. Is it true that the more something becomes a more quote unquote environmentally sustainable item that it's sort of prices people out of the market? And how do we make sustainable fashion choices more accessible?
Absolutely. Well, ultimately, the solution is just buying less, repairing more, buying less. But that's not a realistic expectation to say, don't buy clothes, right? Our bodies change, our needs change if you've got a new job. So ultimately, investing in those materials that kind of align with some of the things we've been talking about. And a lot of times, we have this cost discussion with water bottles, right? A reusable water bottle is more expensive than a single use. But if you look at it at your cost per use, that's ultimately where you see the true value in your investments. And buying good clothes is an investment. So if you're buying materials that are thicker, that are more natural, that are worthwhile to repair and invest, you're ultimately going to be buying less, and your cost per use, you get more use out of it. So some of the fashion examples would be like building your capsule collection where you get all your classics and then look to your fashionable items to kind of inject into your closet. But building that base of really high quality basic goods and your classic goods is a really good solution to kind of keeping a sustainable closet.
I think we also need to target the marketing from these companies that are just pushing fast fashion, saying, well, you're out of style now. Like on Instagram or TikTok, and you're looking, you're like, well, that's no longer in style. You're out of style. No, your style is your style. There is no out of style. It's just a made up concept in order to trick people into buying more material because they feel guilty. They feel that
Yeah.
they don't belong in the society that they're in because they're not wearing a specific type of clothing. And then we just get into this vicious cycle. Um, it's because we were just talking about solutions that everyday people can enact. What are some other solutions for everyday people? If I'm like, how can I be part of the solution when it comes to textile management and waste?
Well, some of the ones we've already talked about, like buying high quality natural fibers, repairing what you have. But some of the other solutions are really advocating for change. I think, especially when you look at what some of the younger generations have already accomplished, and I am totally in that generation, right? But using your voice and not just buying with your dollars and voting with your dollars, but really using your voice to advocate. We have this bill, SB 707, that is in the legislative process. So there's some immediate action that our listeners can take by calling legislators if they're in California. But if you're not in California, you can really call your own legislators, and whether it's your city, county, or state representative, and let them know that you want to be part of the solution. And there are examples of solutions. So not just the California bill, but there are some other proposed solutions across the country and across the world that really engage the population to get involved.
And what are some of those? Because those can be repeated. There's California, there's New York, maybe talk about a little bit of that. But as you were saying, one of the other ways that, getting involved is getting involved in local nonprofit organizations that are working on this. And so if they can come to you, Joanne, and be like, I want to do the same, can that nonprofit come to you and be like, I want to do the same that you're doing with Senate Bill 707? How do I do it in Texas? How do I do it in Houston? How do I do it in Cincinnati? How do I do this? Can they come to you and ask?
Absolutely. Here in California at CPSC, we love collaboration. So we can help, we do a lot of pilot projects with cities and counties that can get replicated to really help collect textiles in a manner that's really circular. The other thing that they can replicate are some of the other things other than policy. So CPSC, we're amazing, but there are so many other NGOs in this space. If you look at some of the ones doing the mending repair workshops, getting and organizing some of those, there are a lot of times in the communities, you already have nonprofits for teaching sewing skills or looking at, I know in the Bay Area near San Francisco, there's some like craft stores that are all like, it's like a thrift store, but just for craft supplies. So supporting businesses like that, there's a lot of local solutions popping up all over the world, and you should be running to those businesses, not walking.
What about the New York City Policy Fashion Act? That's something that's taking, maybe that's something people should look up.
Absolutely. So some of the other policies that are going on right now. So in New York, there's the Fashion Act, and that's a supply chain transparency. What's really interesting, we've talked a couple times about labels. Label regulations haven't been updated in decades, and they're really not up with the times to fiber content and countries and people that are involved. So the New York bill really looks at supply chain transparency and how we can get that missing information that helps long-term with the fiber and chemical management. There's other bills in Maryland. There is a proposed bill that's zero sales tax on secondhand goods that are under $20. this is one of those market levers that really incentivize to buy the reuse and buy, to have that market pull. So we're not just recycling items, we're actually buying those recycled items back into new goods. Another bill at the federal level would be the Fabric Act. So a little different, the Fashion versus Fabric Act. But the Fabric Act at the federal level is really interesting because it's kind of replicating the SB 62 bill in California, which was the one I just referenced on the garment workers minimum wage. So it's taking that concept nationally so that garment workers across the country are still protected. But it adds a couple features like incentives for reshoring manufacturing. It has grants for helping domestic manufacturing get upgrades and become greener. So it's a really great bill that can really use a lot of support. So again, if you're involved in any of these states, calling your legislators, calling the advocates and the lead NGOs in this space would be a really great way to get these bills passed to make meaningful changes.
And before I got a few more questions before we close out our radio podcast version here, but I just want to remind everyone, as usual, we'll have an extended version on our Patreon, and you can access that through our website, ecojusticeradio.org. Are there other resources and organizations that you would recommend people check out?
Depending on where you live, looking at your state or your local waste authority, a lot of those websites are great resources and great citations. If you're looking in the NGO space, I mentioned like OR Foundation is amazing, Fibershed, really great. But other than that, in the waste and recycling space, it's not very big. There's not a lot of people really fighting to reduce the trash, especially at the policy level. So the California Product Stewardship Council, we've been around since 2007. And one of the things that our reputation is built on is we don't give up until something passes, some sort of solution is available.
And what are some, we have a couple more minutes here, but are there some other projects that the California Product Stewardship Council is working on that you just want to briefly mention so that it's in the back of people's mind to keep attention?
Yeah, specific to textiles, we've got a garment repair project in San Francisco with the Goodwill. So again, bringing those garment worker jobs, bringing a lot more innovative repair and upcycling for small designers. That's a really interesting project. Down in Los Angeles, we have a commercial textile recycling project. But outside of textiles, CPSC is actually very active on all product types that are hazardous and hard to manage. So we recently passed one of the best battery recycling EPR bills in the country. We're really proud of that. We also passed one of the largest medicine disposal EPR bills. And just to remind the listeners, this is a producer-run program. So we took on pharma and we won. They are paying for that program. So when you go to your pharmacies and you go to the Rite Aids and Walgreens and you see that kiosk where you throw your medicines for disposal, just know that CPSC passed that law and it's a fully funded program by the industry. So you are not paying with your tax dollars.
And you said earlier that you keep going until it happens. This has been going for more than 10 years that y'all have been trying to get the pharmaceutical industry to step up so that all of us had access to be able to dispose properly of our medications and of our sharps and our lancets.
Yeah, it takes so many different strategies and time and patience. And we have that with textiles. We've already invested 3+ years in these pilot projects and developing some model language that became SB 707. We know this is really not the end of the conversation. And EPR is an ongoing program that engages stakeholders. So you can always attend public meetings, advisory committee meetings. I'm currently the chair of the Mattress Recycling Advisory Committee by CalRecycle and the vice chair of the Carpet Recycling Advisory Committee. So looking to get involved and encourage engagement.
And I'm there, I'm involved. So you can hang out with both of us. Um, Lastly, where can people follow your efforts and that of California Product Stewardship Council?
We're really proud of our work on social media. So CalPSC on Instagram, YouTube. We're still on Facebook because we've got some older audience. But at the end of the day, our website is really a great resource. There's tons of articles, webinars, you name it. So calpsc.org. And if you specifically look at the textiles campaign, you can see all the recent press we've accomplished and how to get involved with SB 707. So there's a really great opportunity to sign on to our coalition letter and join our advocacy group that's going to start meeting here in the next few weeks.
Well, Joanne, this has been an absolutely interesting and fantastic conversation, and a reminder to our audience that we're going to continue this conversation. So go over to our website, ecojusticeradio.org. So go over to our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to hear the extended version of episode 167. So thank you, Joanne. This is it for the radio version, and we will continue the conversation.
Thank you so much.